If you've been tracking with us in the Gospel of Mark, you will have noted repeated demonstrations of the power of Jesus Christ. We see this almost immediately in Mark's Gospel, where Jesus begins healing persons with a variety of afflictions. There is a story or an account of Jesus healing a leper. We see Jesus heal a paralytic, someone who could not walk, who had to be lowered through a roof, and Jesus gives this man the capacity to walk again. We've seen Jesus exert his power and control over nature itself. We have seen Jesus, amid a great storm, calm both the wind and the waves. We have seen recently, in our text last Sunday, Jesus exert his dominion over the spiritual realm as he liberates a man who is suffering under the possession of a legion of demons. These demonstrations of the power of Jesus prepare us for our account that we will look at this morning. We marvel at all that Jesus has done and all that he is able to do. And yet, I want to make sure we are paying equally close attention to the manner in which Jesus exerts his power. As we pursue Christ's likeness, we benefit by carefully tracking not simply what Jesus does, but how he does it. You've heard of the bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? It's an important consideration when you find yourself wondering, how should I act? How should I respond? How should I behave? And we ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask a second question. How would Jesus do it? How would Jesus do it? That is at least an equally important question to ask. Not only do we want to know what Jesus would do, but we want to know how he would do it. And so we're indebted to the gospel writers for their carefulness as they describe for our benefit the manner in which Jesus heals and the tone of Jesus as he acts, especially as Jesus engages persons who are deeply hurting. If your Bibles are open, I hope they are, we begin in verse 21, where Mark explains that Jesus had crossed over to the other side of the lake. It appears that the crowd that Jesus had gotten away from previously was now waiting for his return. And among those who are waiting for the return of Jesus is a synagogue ruler named Jairus, who approaches Jesus and falls at his feet. Jairus' situation is desperate. He says, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." Again, I want to step back from this text just for a minute to note something that you probably already realize, that synagogue rulers are among the harshest critics of Jesus and his ministry. So here it is, one from among the critics of Jesus coming to Jesus looking for help. Evidently, Jairus' predicament is so dire that he's willing to let normal church politics go along the byway. This is to say that Jairus needed Jesus, and no amount of crossed allegiances was going to get in the way. When Jairus describes the situation, he uses the word in the Greek, eschatos. Eschatos. You may recognize eschatos gives us the word eschatology. Eschatology is the theology of last things. And so when Jairus uses the word eschatos, he is saying that this is the end for his daughter. He is saying to Jesus, if you do not come, this is going to be the end of her life. She's at the very end. She's not simply sick. She's not simply in intensive care, but she's in hospice. She's in palliative care. This is the end. Presumably, all other options have been exhausted. That this synagogue ruler has no other choice but to go to Jesus, who was his last hope, and time is running out. Mark tells us that Jesus immediately obliges the request, immediately accompanies Jairus, making us, the reader, hopeful of what the outcome will be. But Mark also tells us in verse 25 that the large crowd continued to follow. And among the crowd is a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Mark further describes how the woman suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. The woman had heard reports of how Jesus had healed others and thought if she could get close enough to Jesus, she could be healed. And that's precisely what happened. The woman touched Jesus, and she was healed by that. And Mark writes in verse 29, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the disease. Jesus, recognizing that the power had gone out from him, asked, "Who touched my garments? Who touched my garments?" I don't know about you, but I wonder what Jairus was thinking during all of this. Imagine you're Jairus, your daughter's at the very end. She's at the point of death. It's an urgent matter. The best equivalent I could think of is picture yourself riding in an ambulance here in Nassau. You're with a beloved, you're with a spouse, you're with a close friend, you're with a sibling. You're in an ambulance in Nassau and you're trying to get to the hospital. But it's the middle of the day and traffic is really bad. And you can't get there as quickly as you would if the roads were empty. But then the ambulance driver spots somebody who's struggling at the side of the road. And so the ambulance pulls over to help that person. If you were in the ambulance, if your loved one was at the point of death, this would cause you anxiety upon anxiety. The slow-moving traffic, that the driver would stop and attend to another person. You would be desperate to get to the hospital. I imagine Jairus was desperate, and he was anxious that Jesus would pause in this way. It's almost as if the disciples feel the anxiety, and they even question the wisdom of Jesus asking, "Who touched my garments?" But Jesus continues to look around. Finally, the emotions of the woman who was healed make it obvious who it is that touched his garments. And she trembles before him. She explains what has happened to him. And Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." I think it says a lot about the character of Jesus that he would stop. The woman's condition was chronic, but it was not urgent. And by stopping, Jesus signals to the woman that her suffering matters. That even though he had a more urgent matter to attend to, Jesus stopped because he wanted the woman to know that her pain means something. And by speaking to the woman and by commending her faith, Jesus is conveying to the woman that she matters. That he would take the time to stop, to hear her story, and to commend her. Jesus wanted the woman to know that she mattered. And then Jesus is interrupted with the worst possible news. Jairus' friends arrive on the scene in verse 35 with the grim report, "Your daughter is dead." I cannot think of a more painful phrase to utter and a more painful phrase to hear. Your daughter is dead. Your son is dead. I've lost track of how many funerals I've done in 23-ish years. I think it's somewhere between 200 and 300 funerals. And I was thinking that through the other day, and it grieved me as I thought, I don't remember every funeral. There's so many funerals I've officiated, and so much time in some cases has passed, I don't remember every funeral. But there are funerals that stand out for me, and it is the funeral that I've conducted for someone's son or someone's daughter. It's hard to explain, but I can tell you for certain, albeit anecdotally, losing a child, whether a young child or an adult child, losing a child is the most unique pain in grief. And I don't want to downplay what it means to lose a spouse or to lose a sibling or to lose a parent. But there is something different. There is something uniquely painful about losing a son or losing a daughter. And as I say that, I'm well aware that there are some worshiping among us, either in person or online, who know this grief, who have experienced this unique pain. Some have learned the hard way. Not every disease is healed by Jesus, and not every accident is prevented by divine providence. I don't know, and I cannot explain, while one person is spared and another is taken. But here is what I do know. Because of the comprehensive testimony of the gospel writers, here's what I do know. That we can have certainty about God's care and concern for our pain. That God has a deep and genuine concern for our pain. In Jesus Christ, we have witness, we have testimony of God who cares deeply about our pain and suffering. We see this as Jesus stops to speak with the woman he has just healed. And we see this in Jesus' dealings with Jairus and his daughter. Jesus says to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." Finally, they break away from the crowd, and when they reach Jairus' home, we're not surprised to read that there was commotion, that people were weeping and wailing loudly. That doesn't surprise us. Someone's daughter has just died. We expect commotion and weeping and loud wailing. Only Peter, James, and John are allowed to go with Jesus and the girl's parents to go inside where the dead girl lay. We are told that Jesus takes the girl's hand. Jesus takes the girl's pulseless hand and he says to her, "Talitha Koum," or in some translations, "Talitha Koumi." And when Mark records this phrase, he's breaking away from the Greek in which he normally writes, and he renders the phrase just as Jesus spoke it in Aramaic, "Talitha Koum." Now, I want to compare what's taking place in Mark 5 with another account of Jesus raising his dead friend Lazarus from John's Gospel, chapter 11. You may recall when Jesus brought Lazarus back from the dead, he did it with a loud voice. If you look at John 11:43, Jesus called out to dead Lazarus in the tomb, 4 days in the tomb. He calls out in a loud voice and he says, "Lazarus, come forth." That's how he raises Lazarus. And that's very different from how Jesus approaches Jairus' daughter. Jesus takes the girl by the hand. Talitha was a common term used for little girl. But the word Talitha doesn't mean little girl. Its literal rendering is little lamb. Little lamb. Jesus uses an affectionate pet name for the girl, the way we might say to our daughter, sweetie or sweetheart. Jesus calls this girl little lamb. And the word koum or kumi means to rise up or to get up. So in this instance, Jesus does not issue a loud summons for resurrection from the dead. In this instance, Jesus gently takes the girl's hand, and he speaks to her the way we might wake up a young child in the morning so as to not startle them. Sweetie, it's time to get up. It's important that we not simply note what Jesus does here, but that we're paying attention to how he does it. The Son of God is tender. He's tender with this family, and he's tender with this little girl. Talitha Koum, little lamb, it's time for you to get up. Immediately, we're told the girl got up and began walking around. Mark records what we would expect. Everyone is overcome by amazement, thinking of the manner of Jesus in this account. Alistair Begg spends a lot of time talking about the significance of the fact that Jesus touched this little girl, that he touched this little girl who is dead. Because to touch a dead person is to make oneself ceremonially unclean. And if you're ceremonially unclean, you're unfit for worship in the synagogue. And remember, Jairus is a synagogue ruler himself. He's an elder in the synagogue, and he would have been acutely aware of what Jesus had done by touching his dead daughter, that Jesus had become ceremonially unclean. The rationale behind this prohibition is that when you touch a dead body, there's an adverse effect to that there's a kind of contamination, or at the very least, a ceremonial contamination. But that principle doesn't hold true when the one who is doing the touching is the creator of all things. The principle doesn't hold true when the one touching the dead body is the Son of God. Jesus is not adversely affected by touching a dead body. A dead body is profoundly affected by the touch of Jesus. A dead body is profoundly affected by the touch of Jesus. By the touch of Jesus, the blind see, and the deaf hear, and the lame walk, and the dead come back to life again. Alistair Begg says it well. Jesus touches death so that those who are held in its grip are set free. Jesus touches death so that those who are held in its grip are set free. We rightly marvel at the power and the tenderness of Jesus as he brings a 12-year-old girl back to life again. But our marveling ought not to be limited to Jesus raising this little girl. The New Testament is clear on this point. What Jesus did for this little girl, he does for every person who trusts in him. The great work of Jesus Christ, by way of his life, by way of his death and by way of his resurrection is to make persons who are spiritually dead come alive. This is what Paul says to the Ephesians when he says, God being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. If you are a Christian, I want you to realize that this is not some ideology that you've signed on to. If you are a Christian, you've passed from death into life. You've passed from darkness into light. For some of you, this happened when your soul heard an authoritative summons from Jesus. Come forth. Some of you can remember the day when Jesus summoned your soul back to life. It was like an authoritative call or summons. Come forth. But for others, Jesus approached us tenderly. Jesus took our hand, as it were, and said to our soul, it's time to get up. It's time to get up. Making the dead come back to life, this is what Jesus does. This is his specialty. And we marvel at what he did for this little girl, but we ought to marvel in what Jesus has done for us. We ought to look at our own story and marvel that he would make a dead man come back to life, that he would make someone who lived in darkness now walk in light, that he would wake us up, that we would come alive. Marvel at what he's done for us. You see, it's not simply that we didn't know what to do, and so Jesus gives us some information. It's not simply that we were lost, and Jesus put us on the correct path. It's not even the case that we were drowning, and that Jesus threw us a lifeline. We were dead. We were totally unresponsive to God and to every spiritual reality. Even while we may have been physically strong, we may have been full of energy, perfect bill of health, but dead inside. We're not right on the inside. In the footsteps of Adam, Paul says we're dead in our trespasses and sins. That's how life begins. And some of you are hearing that and you're thinking, this sounds scary. I wish the pastor wouldn't talk about such things, such negative things about my walking in darkness and deadness and sin. It sounds scary, and it is scary. But then along comes Jesus, who says, don't be afraid. Only believe. Don't be afraid of the current condition of things. Believe that I can make things well. And so Jesus takes us by the hand, as it were, and he commands our soul to get up. And now we who have been made alive by Jesus, we owe him everything. Marvel at what Jesus has done for you and recognize that is, if he has made you alive, you owe him everything. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, and my all. May we give him nothing less than that. Amen.